Unless people invest money in the companies you work for, you don't have work. All that we have ever asked from management is an even shake for you, the men and women who make the goods that bring profits to everyone. I respect the investor, and so should you. We're in favor of the investor getting dividends as high as humanly possible, but not at your expense. You're entitled to some of that money for the work you have performed. I want to point out to you here and now that I would like you to become a part and parcel of union work. Get interested in union activities and affairs, for we're growing, and we're going to need more help in running the affairs of this union. Remember, the International is only as strong as its locals and its members, and the ability and active interest that you put in at the grassroots level will be automatically reflected in our work here.
The worker in the average mill, mine, shop, or factory was once a very lonely and faceless individual. He was a clock number, and his value was measured only in terms of productivity. He was fired at the whim of the boss. When his pay was cut, he took it on the chin and suffered in silence. But in 1936, the men and women in these industries made up their minds to do something about their deplorable conditions. They built the most powerful union of all time, the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, later to become the United Steelworkers of America and Canada. With the union came dignity and recognition. It brought the worker the right to speak his piece. It brought a cooperative relationship with co-workers instead of a dog-eat-dog existence. Out of the struggle to build the union has emerged a new term, industrial democracy. Out of the bitterness has grown a more rational labor management relationship which defines mutual rights and responsibilities. The key to this dramatic change is the United Steelworkers of America, the union of more than 1 million men and women who work in the mills, mines, and factories.
I remember in 1936, before the strike, it was very, very hot. And down in the Chevrolet, there were people who were dropping over because of the heat. And the other workers were told, just step over them until we can get them out of the way. They didn't slow down the line. They didn't stop it. And they just dragged people away. It was terrible. And I think that's one thing that really helped bring on the strike.
Which side are you on, boys? Which side are you on?
The roots of the Progressive Era reforms began many years earlier. For over 80 years, presidents and federal politicians had rewarded their supporters with lucrative government jobs. It was called patronage, or the spoils system, from an old war slogan. Following the Civil War and Reconstruction, the American public grew increasingly disgusted with government corruption and favoritism. Some members of the Republican Party began a reform movement. Nicknamed mugwumps, they were influential Republicans who refused to support their party's presidential candidate, who they believed opposed reform. The progressive movement gained momentum and followers as Americans read the work of writers and journalists who exposed corruption in government and business and described the deplorable life of many working-class Americans. These writers became popularly known as muckrakers, from a character in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress who raked up the mud and muck of the world. Author Upton Sinclair shocked the nation with his graphic description of the filth and appalling working conditions in Chicago meatpacking plants. Ida Tarbell described the cutthroat tactics used to eliminate competition by big businesses like Standard Oil. Jacob Riis, an immigrant himself, wrote a first-hand account of life in the slums, while Lincoln Steffens, considered the leader of the muckraking movement, exposed the corruption so rampant in city government. As Americans read these muckraking books and magazine articles, they became not only aware of the country's problems, they demanded and supported reforms in both business and government. Meanwhile, state government reforms moved forward. Other progressive governors, such as Charles Evan Hughes of New York and Hiram Johnson of California were joined by ordinary citizens like William S. Uren of Oregon. With his urging, Oregon adopted 4 election reforms. The secret ballot, where voters individually get an official ballot and vote in a private booth. The initiative, giving voters the right to put issues on a ballot for a vote. The recall, which granted voters the right to remove an elected official. And perhaps most importantly, the direct primary, in which voters choose candidates for office rather than political party leaders. The direct primary led to the adoption of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, giving Americans the ability to directly elect their state senators. These progressives felt they could improve capitalism by making government more responsive to social inequities. Progressives wanted instead to reform government and business, ensuring decent working conditions and wages and fair governmental rule.
Oh, freedom is mine, and I know how I feel. It's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new life for me.
On May 9, 1872, a small crowd of women fighting for equal rights gathered for the National Women's Suffrage Convention at Steinway Hall in New York City. Elizabeth Cady Stanton resigned as president, and Susan B. Anthony was elected to replace her. Victoria Woodhull entered the hall. All eyes were on her as she gracefully approached the stage. She was young, beautiful. There was something about her blue eyes that drew you in. Susan B. Anthony was about to adjourn the meeting when Victoria took the platform. She wanted to invite the National Women's Suffrage Association to join the Equal Rights Party to nominate candidates for President and Vice President of the United States. The Equal Rights Party was comprised of both men and women. Susan B. Anthony flatly refused.
If she were influenced by women's spirits, I might consent. But she is wholly owned and dominated by men's spirits, and I spurn the control of the whole lot of them. Susan B. Anthony.
The truth was that nobody owned or dominated Victoria Woodhull. Ignoring Susan B. Anthony, Victoria took the platform and carried the motion overwhelmingly. Everyone was invited to join the Equal Rights Party the following morning at Apollo Hall.
Order! 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 Order!
Anthony furiously rapped her gavel. This didn't bother Victoria, who continued to speak. In a huff, Anthony stormed off and demanded the janitor to turn off the gas lights.
From this convention will go forth a tide of revolution that shall sweep over the whole...
Victoria, still talking, was left in the dark. The next day, over 600 delegates met at Apollo Hall to join Victoria Woodhull and the Equal Rights Party. These people represented radical organizations throughout the country. Some were communists, spiritualists, free lovers, and suffragists. This was an important day for them. They were going to nominate candidates for President and Vice President of the United States.
From this convention will go forth a tide of revolution that shall sweep over the whole world. What does freedom mean? The inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What is equality?
Victoria Woodhull's beauty may have gotten the audience's attention, but her speech captivated them.
A revolution shall sweep with resistless force over the whole country to purge it of political trickery and all industrial injustice.
Judge Carter of Cincinnati stood to announce,
I nominate Victoria C. Woodhull for the President of the United States. All in favor say aye.
I thank you from the bottom of my soul for the honor you conferred upon me. I have stood by you so long, sometimes meriting your applause and sometimes encountering your rebuffs, but I have always been faithful to my principles.
Black reformer and lecturer Frederick Douglass was nominated as vice president. Victoria Woodhull became the first woman in American history to be nominated for the presidency.
Woodhull was born in 1838, the 7th of 10 children in a rural Ohio town of Homer, to a mother who was illiterate and a father who was, according to most accounts, a petty criminal. She had no formal education, only a few years of sporadic elementary school education and a terrible first marriage at 15 to a womanizing alcoholic, which led Woodhull to spend the rest of her life fighting for a woman's right to not only choose the course of her own destiny, but to control that course every step of the way. After making her first fortune as a healer, clairvoyant, and spiritualist, she found herself in New York City, where she became, wait for it, the first female stockbroker on Wall Street. That's right. Victoria and her sister Tennessee made about $700,000 during the gold panic of 1869 and opened their own firm, Woodhull, Clayfick, Lynn and Company. But despite their success, the first woman wasn't even given a seat on the stock exchange until 1967. Interesting. The image of a woman and an African-American man on the same ticket in the 1800s of America is about as radical as they come. Woodhull, of course, was treated with just about as much respect as any woman for running for office at any time seems to be able to expect. She was accused of being a witch, a prostitute, and even spent Election Day in jail because she had written a newspaper article exposing a popular religious figure as an adulterous hypocrite. Color me shocked. In the end, while her name was on the ballot in some states, votes for her weren't even counted. It was Victoria Woodhull who put those cracks in the glass ceiling that make it possible for us to shatter. And to all the women and girls out there wondering if this fight is worth it, wondering if they deserve to fight for a position that has always been held by someone different from them, I want you to remember the words of the first woman to run for President of the United States.
I ain't got no home in this world anymore.
If you are the average American who watches television 40 hours a week, you have probably heard of such important people as Kojak and Wonder Woman, have heard about dozens of different kinds of underarm spray deodorants, every hack politician in your state, and the latest game between the Boston Red Sox and the New York Yankees. Strangely enough, however, nobody has told you about Gene Debs, one of the most important Americans of the 20th century. Why? Why haven't they told you about Gene Debs and the ideas he fought for? The answer is simple. More than a half-century after his death, the handful of people who own and control this country, including the mass media and the educational system, still regard Debs and his ideas as dangerous, as a threat to their stability and class rule, and as someone best forgotten about. When American workers needed a radical independent political party to stand up to the Democratic and Republican parties which represented the interests of the capitalist class, Debs was there. He helped found the Socialist Party and ran for president on its ticket 5 times.
Every 4 years, the Democratic and Republican parties come forward and tell the working people of this country all that they're going to do for them, how they're going to end unemployment, raise wages, lower prices, and stop war. Gene Debs didn't believe a word of it. He believed that the only way that workers could protect their own interests was to have a political party of their own, a socialist party.
The workers know that under Republican rule and Democratic rule, conditions for them have remained unchanged. They know that under the administration of both, depressions come, that unemployment is certain, and that many of their number are doomed to drift into poverty and crime, and finally end their lives as beggars, suicides, in prison cells, or on the scaffold. They know, too, that under both Democrat and Republican rule, the president is on the side of the capitalists, that the governors are all on the side of the capitalists, that Congress and all the state legislators respond to the demands of the capitalists, that the courts are uniformly with the capitalists, while soldiers and injunctions and jails are for the exclusive benefit of the workers. In capitalist society, the working man is not, in fact, considered a man at all, but as a wage worker is bought and sold on the open market, the same as hair, hide, salt, or any other merchandise. In capitalist society, the owner can pay a worker as low a wage as he can get away with, and then fire him the first day that he can no longer make a profit off of his labor. Is that what freedom is about? Or is that what slavery is about? Wage slavery.
He refused to believe that the suffering that he saw all about him, the poverty, ignorance, war, and exploitation, was caused by God or nature.
He believed rather that much of human suffering was caused by an irrational and cruel economic system, capitalism, which functioned not to improve the quality of life for all the people, but simply to enrich the bank accounts of the few who owned and controlled the economy.
During and after the First World War, when free speech was virtually abolished in this country, when radicals and anti-war activists were thrown into jail for expressing their opinions, when newspapers were censored and closed down by the government, when citizens were fired from their jobs because of their political views, Gene Debs was there. On numerous occasions, he put his life on the line by speaking out against the imperialist slaughter taking place in Europe.
Eugene V. Debs had not always been a socialist, or a revolutionary, or an enemy of the capitalist system. In fact, when he was a young man, his views were rather conventional. It was not until he was 39 years old that he adopted his socialist principles.
In the East, he saw children working 14 hours a day in factories and sweatshops, and workers competing with their sons and daughters for jobs which paid subsistence wages. At Homestead, Pennsylvania, he saw workers attempting to improve their conditions murdered by the hired thugs of Andrew Carnegie, that noble philanthropist. And in city after city, he saw the festering tenements and shacks where millions were forced to live.
In the South, he saw blacks terrorized, lynched, and beaten, and poor whites indoctrinated with race hatred by their employers in order to prevent any chance of black-white working-class unity.
In the West, he saw lumbermen laboring under slave-like conditions and little boys working from sunrise to sunset in the mines. In Ludlow, Colorado, he saw women and children shot down and burned alive by Rockefeller's police force during a long and bitter strike at the Colorado Coal Company.
Across the nation, he could see politicians and judges bought and sold by John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Corporation and the other big companies, and a political system in which women and most blacks didn't even have the right to vote. In 1908, in New York City, Debs spoke before 10,000 people, and the New York Times called it the greatest political meeting ever held in that city. In San Diego, California, 15,000 workers paid their way to a Socialist Party meeting to hear him speak. And in Cincinnati, Ohio, more people came to hear Debs than to hear William Howard Taft, the Republican candidate who was soon to become president.
Throughout his life, Debs was hailed by many as a prophet, a Moses, a man who would lead the American working class out of the desert of capitalism and into the promised land of socialism. But Debs rejected that role. He said that if the workers were dependent upon some famous leader to take them into socialism, then some other famous leader would come along a few years later and lead them right back into capitalist slavery. For Debs, the workers had to lead themselves and take responsibility for their own lives. Sitting in his prison cell for a 6-month term, Debs had time to reflect upon the events of the past year and to think about a government which had come to the aid of millionaire railroad owners while destroying an organization fighting for the rights of starving workers. While in prison, he also began reading socialist books and literature that friends were sending him, such as Marx's Das Kapital and works by Karl Kautsky, the German Marxist.
Debs had entered the Woodstock jail in the spring of 1895 as a militant trade unionist who was fighting for the rights of workers to earn a decent wage within the system. He left the jail 6 months later as a radical socialist who believed that workers could never receive justice under the capitalist system, and that it was necessary for the working class itself to take over the means of production and the government.
The answer is simple, the answer is clear. We'll all get together with nothing to fear and throw the old bastard right out on his ear. Farewell to the High Sheriff of Hazard.
They were victims of disease and drifting into crime. To remedy this, they sought to pattern their life after successful Americans. They must work hard, save money, become employers and property owners and investors. This, they thought, would bring them recognition as American citizens equal to others. But America changed. There was still a chance for some to rise and get rich, but the working classes were no longer generally able to buy land. Their wages did not amount to what they in reality earned, and those handicapped by race prejudice had small chance to overcome poverty and ignorance and disease. The essence of the democratic process is free discussion. There was a time when men were not allowed to talk about universal suffrage, or the education of women, or freedom for Negro slaves. Today, communism is the dirty word, and socialism is suspect. With the death of Roosevelt came reaction. The United States not only stopped progress toward socialism, but ceased to discuss or study it, and came to regard the object of socialism and communism as a crime. We saw democracy failing in America. Fewer and fewer people went to the polls. It was increasingly difficult to know for whom or for what one was voting, and the cost of elections arose to suspicious heights. The election in which Abraham Lincoln became President of the United States cost about $100,000. The election which made Dwight Eisenhower President probably cost more than $100 million. It's possible that it cost twice that. Election expenses today include not only direct bribery, but indirect influences, monopoly, propaganda, and deception. Under these circumstances, the appeal of socialism to all Americans increased. But the answer to the doctrines of Karl Marx and the utopias of Fourier and others was that with human nature as it is, socialism simply would not work. Governmental power to the individual voter, with all the freedom of action that can be preserved, along with an industry carefully organized for the good of the masses of people and not for the manufacture of millionaires. Does capitalism offer such a program? It does not. It offers war. We have gone insane with the idea that the world is going to be ruled by physical force. More than any other nation on earth or in time, we are spending fantastic sums of money to prepare for war and basing this necessity of war preparation on dislike and distrust and contempt for most of the human beings who inhabit the world. We have no peace movement in the United States that deserves the name. We have almost no men of intelligence and prestige who dare speak up for peace. Cowed and silent, we face immeasurable catastrophe, and the first duty of Americans is to realize this fact. There are signs in this nation which should give us pause. There is stealing, cheating, poisoning, gambling, and killing to a frightening degree. Our exports do not pay for our imports, and we are settling the deficit by exporting $4,000 million of our hoard of gold in the past 2 years. Unemployment among our workers, despite our desperate efforts to conceal the truth, is far too high. Adulteration of food and overpricing of medicines have reached alarming heights, and the cost of living is continuously rising. Despite opposition, I spoke plainly. I was criticized as being bitter, as seeking not simply political but social equality for Negroes, for favoring the teachings of Karl Marx, and for joining the Socialist Party. These accusations were true. In 1949, 25 Americans were invited to attend a Soviet Peace Congress with expenses paid. I was the only one who accepted. I addressed a cross-section of that great nation. I did not, as I would have been justified in doing, devote this opportunity to describing the plight of my people. On the contrary, I contended that I was speaking for those Americans who did not want war, and that they were a majority of the nation. No one visiting the Soviet Union at that time could for a moment doubt its peaceful intentions. In 1958, I was able to make a trip covering 11 months in which I visited Western Europe, Eastern Europe, including the Soviet Union, and the Republic of China. This trip completely transformed my thinking. I started on it believing that socialism was a possible form of government and economic organization and was being carried on successfully in Eastern Europe. That capitalism was also a successful form of organization, and while it might degenerate into fascism and the rule of wealth, nevertheless, it could, as had been proven by Franklin Roosevelt, become a progressive organization. I returned with completely changed ideas. I saw socialism as the most successful form of government today possible in the Soviet Union and in the Chinese Republic. I saw it evolving into communism to an astonishing successful degree. On the other hand, I was frightened, and I am still alarmed at the degeneracy of capitalism and the possibility of it becoming a force so destructive that it cannot be endured.
Where have all the soldiers gone? Gone to graveyards, everyone. When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn?
When Major General Smedley Darlington Butler died on June 21st, 1940, he died as the most decorated Marine in U.S. history. Having received 16 medals, including 5 for heroism, Smedley Butler was one of only 19 people who have ever been twice awarded the Medal of Honor, and one of only 2 that have ever twice received the Medal of Honor for separate acts of outstanding heroism. But if ever we need to be reminded that the human spirit is dynamic and we cannot be simply reduced to a sum of our genetic and environmental parts, perhaps all we need to do is take a look at the life of Smedley Butler.
War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of people. Only a small inside group knows what it's about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. I believe in adequate defense at the coastline and nothing else. If a nation comes over here to fight, then we'll fight. The trouble with America is that when the dollar only earns 6% over here, then it gets restless and goes overseas to get 100%. Then the flag follows the dollar and the soldiers follow the flag. I wouldn't go to war again as I have done to protect some lousy investment of the bankers. There are only 2 things we should fight for. One is the defense of our homes, and the other is the Bill of Rights. War for any other reason is simply a racket. There isn't a trick in the racketeering bag that the military gang is blind to. It has its finger men to point out enemies, its muscle men to destroy enemies, its brain men to plan war preparations, and a big boss, super-nationalistic capitalism. It may seem odd for me, a military man, to adopt such a comparison. Truthfulness compels me to. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service as a member of this country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. I served in all commissioned ranks from 2nd lieutenant to major general, and during that period, I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. Like all the members of the military profession, I never had a thought of my own until I left the service. My mental faculties remained in suspended animation while I obeyed the orders of higher-ups. This is typical with everyone in the military service. I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of 6 Central American republics for the benefits of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. In China, I helped to see to it that Standard Oil went its way unmolested. During those years, I had, as the boys in the back room would say, a swell racket. Looking back on it, I feel I could have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. Out of war, nations acquire additional territory, if they are victorious. They just take it. This newly acquired territory promptly is exploited by the few, the selfsame few who wrung dollars out of blood in the war. The general public shoulders the bill. And what is this bill? This bill renders a horrible accounting. Newly placed gravestones, mangled bodies, shattered minds, broken hearts and homes, economic instability, depression and all its attendant miseries, backbreaking taxation for generations and generations. For a great many years as a soldier, I had a suspicion that war was a racket. Not until I retired to civil life did I fully realize it. Now that I see the international war clouds again gathering, as they are today, I must face it and speak out. We would be all stirred up to hate Japan and go to war. A war that might cost us tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives of Americans, and many more hundreds of thousands of physically maimed and mentally unbalanced men. Of course, for this loss, there would be a compensating profit. Fortunes would be made. Millions and billions of dollars would be piled up by a few. Munitions makers, shipbuilders, manufacturers, meat packers, speculators, they would fare well. Yes, they are getting ready for another war. Why shouldn't they? It pays high dividends. But what does it profit the masses? What does it profit the men who are killed? What does it profit the men who are maimed? What does it profit their mothers and sisters, their wives and their sweethearts? What does it profit their children? What does it profit anyone except the very few to whom war means huge profits? Yes, and what does it profit the nation? We acquired outside territory. At the end of the World War period, as a direct result of our fiddling in international affairs, our national debt had jumped to over $25 billion. Therefore, on a purely financial bookkeeping basis, we ran a little behind year for year, and that foreign trade might well have been ours without the wars. It would have been far cheaper, not to say safer, for the average American who pays the bills to stay out of foreign entanglements.
On Tuesday, the 20th of November, 1934, this was perhaps the most serious case the country could possibly have faced, and the room where it all took place is up several flights of stairs in what's known as the supper room.
One of the most important witnesses who came here was Paul Cumley French, a journalist Smedley Butler took into his confidence after the conspirators had tried to recruit him. French had also met chief plotter Gerald Maguire at his Wall Street offices, and he recounted their conversation to the committee.
"We need a fascist government in this country," he insisted, "to save the nation from the communists who want to tear it down and wreck all that we have built in America. The only men who have the patriotism to do it are the soldiers, and Smedley Butler is the ideal leader. He could organize 1 million men overnight. During the course of the conversation, he continually discussed the need of a man on a white horse, as he called it, a dictator who would come galloping in on his white horse. He said that was the only way to save the capitalistic system.
Jules Archer, who went on to study the lives of Smedley Butler and Representative John McCormack, is convinced the plot was real. He remembers talking to McCormack about his time as chairman of the committee that investigated the case.
McCormack was a veteran politician. He was an advisor to Roosevelt and other presidents. He had a heavy Irish accent. He told me General Smedley Butler was one of the outstanding Americans in our history. I cannot emphasize too strongly the very important part he played in exposing the fascist plot in the early 1930s, backed by and planned by persons possessing tremendous wealth. There was no doubt about it that McCormack was absolutely convinced that Butler was telling the truth.
But who was going to fund the coup? Even with the backing of 500,000 veterans, a plot of this sort against the most powerful government on earth needs money as well as muscle, and an awful lot of it too. Well, according to Smedley Butler, this was where the big business moguls and Wall Street brokers behind the coup came in. They, he was told by Maguire, would soon step out of the shadows in the form of a newly created lobby group. Soon after he made this promise to Butler, the American Liberty League was born. John Buchanan.
Maguire said, well, you're going to see in the next few weeks in the press, this organization is going to be created that's going to front for the whole thing, and we're going to stand up for the Constitution, and we're going to stand up for our troops and so on. And lo and behold, about 2 weeks later, splashed all over the major newspapers of the time, especially in New York and Washington, the creation of the American Liberty League.
So who, pray tell, was behind the American Liberty League? Well, only some of the biggest names from Wall Street and the world of commerce in 1930s America, including the DuPont family, who was one of the major funders of the ALL, but also the leaders of U.S. Steel, General Motors, General Foods, Standard Oil, Birdseye, Colgate, Heinz Foods, Chase National Bank, and Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, among many, many others. So what became of this plot and the McCormick-Dickstein Committee which was looking into it? Well, as one might well imagine with a congressional inquiry into such a sensitive matter, it ended up going absolutely nowhere. So, long story short, the committee looked into it, found out it was absolutely true, brought absolutely none of the accused before the committee to answer for this activity, with the sole exception of the man that General Butler had direct contact with, Gerald C. Maguire, who denied all knowledge of the plot. Surprise, surprise. And there it pretty much ended. But although the plot had been exposed briefly and then covered up again and consigned to the dustbin of history, from whence it would not be resurrected for another several decades, General Butler, at any rate, had been personally affected by what he had personally experienced in this plot, and I think it was quite evident that he was quite shaken up by what he had just experienced, because the McCormick-Dickstein Committee issued its final report in early 1935, and later that year, General Butler was to pen the pamphlet for which he is perhaps best known today, War is a Racket. Well, it's a racket, all right. A few profit and the many pay, but there is a way to stop it. You can't end it by disarmament conferences. You can't eliminate it by peace parleys at Geneva. Well-meaning but impractical groups can't wipe it out by resolutions. It can be smashed effectively only by taking the profit out of war. The only way to smash this racket is to conscript capital and industry and labor before the nation's manhood can be conscripted. 1 month before the government can conscript the young men of the nation, it must conscript capital and industry and labor. Let the officers and the directors and the high-powered executives of our armament factories and our munitions makers and our shipbuilders and our airplane builders and the manufacturers of all the other things that provide profit in wartime, as well as the bankers and the speculators, be conscripted to get $30 a month, the same wage as the lads in the trenches get. Let the workers in these plants get the same wages. All the workers, all presidents, all executives, all directors, all managers, all bankers, yes, and all generals, and all admirals, and all officers, and all politicians, and all government office holders. Everyone in the nation be restricted to a total monthly income not to exceed that paid to the soldier in the trenches. Let all these kings and tycoons and masters of business and all those workers in industry and all our senators and governors and majors pay half of their monthly $30 wage to their families and pay war risk insurance and buy Liberty bonds. Why shouldn't they? They aren't running any risk of being killed or having their bodies mangled or their minds shattered. They aren't sleeping in muddy trenches. They aren't hungry. The soldiers are. Give capital and industry and labor 30 days to think it over, and you will find by that time there will be no war. That will smash the war racket. That and nothing else. Maybe I am a little too optimistic. Capital still has some say, so capital won't permit the taking of the profit out of war until the people, those who do the suffering and still pay the price, make up their minds that those they elect to office shall do their bidding and not that of the profiteers. Another step necessary in this fight to smash the war racket is the limited plebiscite to determine whether a war should be declared. A plebiscite not of all the voters, but merely of those who would be called upon to do the fighting and the dying. There wouldn't be very much sense in having a 76-year-old president of a munitions factory, or the flat-footed head of an international banking firm, or the cross-eyed manager of a uniform manufacturing plant, all of whom see visions of tremendous profits in the events of war, voting on whether the nation should go to war or not. They never would be called upon to shoulder arms, to sleep in a trench and to be shot. Only those who would be called upon to risk for their lives for their country should have the privilege of voting to determine whether the nation should go to war. But we've been taught to take such words as the insane mutterings of the radical right or the extreme left or whatever way they want to try to twist those words into one of their little categories to wrap it up in a pretty pink bow and then cast it off to the side. Whereas, of course, it does represent the majority opinion of the mass of the people. But the gangster elite for whom war is their plaything and a profit-making device for them can keep us locked in the matrix, believing that we are in fact the minority by parading the talking heads of TV in front of us, saying just how necessary these wars are. And perhaps the clearest example of that very procedure came just 2 years ago in April of 2008 when the New York Times had an expose on behind TV analysts' Pentagon's hidden hand, in which it turns out that, surprise, surprise, all the talking heads that Fox and CNN and all of the major news networks have on to advocate war just happen to, oh, by the way, be on the Pentagon payroll, secretly and not disclosed, always being touted as retired generals or military analysts instead of Pentagon shills, which is exactly what they are. So when you see these talking heads on TV, of course I'm not talking to the general listener out there who well knows this, but when you see these people, you are seeing paid shills of the gangsters who profit from the wars that they create. And guess who pays with their lives for these wars? Hint, it's not the people who are sending the young men and women of today off to die.
We didn't know, said the puzzle voter, watching the president on TV. I guess we got to drop those bombs if we're gonna keep South Asia free.
The story of women in Congress begins with Jeannette Rankin, who is elected to the House in 1916 from Montana. She's elected to the House 4 years before women had the right to vote nationally. And in a way, she's really a bridge from the suffrage movement to women attaining full political rights. She was active in a national women's suffrage organization. She helped women get the right to vote not only in Montana, but a couple of states west of the Mississippi. And she runs in 1916. She's elected to one of Montana's 2 at-large districts. And part of her platform is that she's a pacifist. She's sworn into the House on April 2nd, 1917. And the House has come into special session, extraordinary session, because the president that night, Woodrow Wilson, delivers a message to Congress asking for a declaration of war against Germany. This is the U.S. entry into World War I. And Rankin when that vote is held, is one of a group of about 50 members who votes against U.S. intervention in World War I. She's also involved in international peace organizations. Well, fast forward to 1940, she runs for Congress again, and she runs on a platform to keep the U.S. Out of the war in Europe. And she's faced on December 8th, 1941, with a tremendous vote. This is the day after Pearl Harbor. FDR has come to the House chamber. He's addressed a joint session of Congress.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The Senate goes back to its chamber and very quickly unanimously passes a war resolution, and the House begins debating, and the House members know that Jeannette Rankin is a pacifist, and she is going to vote her conscience. So we have some oral histories of people who were in the chamber who recall members going up to Rankin and asking her just to vote present, don't vote no. And, but she votes her conscience in the end, and she opposes the war. She's the lone vote against U.S. entry into World War II with the declaration of war against Japan. That effectively ended her political career. She goes back into private life, and but she's a force in the anti-war movement really for another couple decades, but a remarkable career.
Oh boy, you're bound to die. Oh boy, you're bound to die.
Oh boy, you're bound to die.
How are you going to feed the balance of the people? What's Morgan and Baruch and Rockefeller and Mellon going to do with all that grub? They can't eat it. They can't wear the clothes. They can't live in the house. Give them a yacht. Give them a palace. Send them to Reno and give them a new wife when they want it. If that's what they want. But when they've got everything on the God's living earth that they can eat and they can wear and they can live in, and all that their children can live in and wear and eat and all their children's children can use, then we got to call Mr. Morgan and Mr. Mellon and Mr. Rockefeller back and say, come back here. Put that stuff back on this table here that you took away from here, that you don't need. Leave something else for the American people to consume. And that's the program.
When princes meet, the poor little men must tremble. In judgment seat, they speak of their wars while great armies assemble. Their armor shines to shame the sun. They move like gods, they do resemble. All bow their necks to iron feet when princes meet. When castles rise, the poor little men must build them. To charm the skies, they throw up the turrets where the great lords will them. They dig the dungeons from the earth, and their brothers, wives, and children fill them. All those below cast down their eyes when castles rise. God save the King, for he grants us leave to serve him. His praises sing, and grant that we may deserve him. Who counts the cost, the cattle and men to be lost? 'Tis no small thing to serve a king. When kings make war, the poor little men must fight them. They must do more. They hold out their necks for great lords' swords to bite them. The sons of lords cleave through their ranks in the hope some warrior king might knight them. It's what the poor little men are for when kings make war.
Drive your cattle to the woods, Francois. The Lord is looking your way. Hide your women and your goods, Francois. They're coming around to make you pay. Hide if you can, poor little man. Think of a prayer to say. Hide if you can, poor little man. Think of a prayer to say.
God save the King, for he grants us leave to serve him. His praises sing, and grant that we may deserve him. Who counts that cause the cattle and men to be lost. 'Tis no small thing to serve a king. When kings make war, the poor little men must fight them. They must do more. They hold out their necks for great lords' swords to bite them. The sons of lords bleed through their ranks in the hope some warrior king might knight them. It's what the poor little men are for when kings make wars. It's what the poor little men are for when kings make wars.